Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Mr. Robot Season 3, Episode 2, Undo. This video is part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Mr. Robot, so I'll have to start with a spoiler warning for Mr. Robot up to Season 3, Episode 2. If you haven't seen up to this point, you may not want to watch this video, otherwise some things may be spoiled for you. So, this episode was amazing. I'm just going to go right out and say it. It has me feeling very hopeful for Season 3 as a whole. Like I said last week, I was impressed with the first episode, that it looked like Season 3 was going to be out there, but I was almost expecting this episode to suck. I was saying, okay, they start out the season good, now it's time for them to get into the filler. And it's even better than last week. They're doubling down. This episode was just, it had a bunch of different storylines, a bunch of different story beats and stuff happening, and every single one was amazing. It was awesome. It pushed the story forward. It had amazing character development, amazing character, introspects, and just everything about this episode was what I love about Mr. Robot, and I think it's one of the better episodes of the entire show, to be perfectly frank. I was just simply blown away by it. Now, I am kind of thinking maybe next week is going to be the time when the show starts getting into the boring filler, or maybe it's the mid-season. It's almost always the mid-season, especially for this show. It's like episode 4 or 5 are the ones that kind of suck. But I'm really hoping that it's not just these first 2 episodes, that they keep up this momentum throughout the entire series. And I think it's possible, and from what I've seen so far, it's showing a lot of promise that this season is going to be the best season yet. So we start the episode with this amazing montage. Now, Mr. Robot is known for doing these really cool, trippy montages that are just awesome and sometimes funny. This one was funny. It was well put together. It was amazing. And more than that, it was connected to the story and really helped push the story forward. There were some great montages in Season 2, like the pill-popping montage when he was doing all the Adderall to try to get rid of Mr. Robot. That's a cool montage, and I have nothing... I don't want to bash that one, but it was kind of not that important to the story. It didn't really do much to push the overall story forward, whereas this one did. And that just made it even more great. I mean, it was just so funny, especially it added in moments of humor, when Elliot was trying to divert the papers from coming to New York, so he diverted the trucks to South Dakota, and they actually had a scene of those guys saying, well, I just do what the paper tells me. It tells me to go to South Dakota. And it's like, yeah, you're in South Dakota, but this makes no sense. It was brilliant in the way it was edited into the rest of the montage. And of course, it is reminiscent a bit of Season 1 of Angela's original boyfriend, who was a bit of a douche, who kept pestering Elliot and he didn't like him, where there was this other guy who worked at E-Corp with him, who just sat behind him and blather on about just meaningless crap that Elliot would just completely ignore him. I mean, there are some differences. It's not like a carbon copy or repetitive or anything, but it has that element to it. But I actually just think it just added to the montage. And then, of course, there was Elliot working through the system, going to his superior, and that superior was being a douche and talking about going to a Goo Goo Dolls reunion. I really hope there's no such thing, and who the hell would go to that? But I guess that's the point. Anyway, and so he's just okay, I'm going to hack him, and you find out he's up to some shady shit, so the FBI shows up, and then the next guy, his next superior goes to, that guy is an even bigger douche, so he's hashed him and the FBI, and I loved how it had those repetitive beats. So that's what made this montage work, is the way they had that same FBI agent would just show up in someone's office, and the way they edited together, where you just see her there, or just walk in, and then, of course, once he did get to the right superior who actually listened to him. He stopped, doing that, but he's like, okay, now it's time to just clean up E-Corp and fix it from within. So he just went to a bunch of random people who were doing shady, illegal shit and had the FBI. And I love how they had the jump cuts of the FBI with all the various different people that he was walking out the building. It was so good. And then, of course, this addresses a lot of complaints, a lot of people's issues that they had with the first 2 seasons. As they said, that Elliot comes off as really naive, and they also almost thought of it as like the show presenting like a naive view of the world where, corporations are evil and the hackers are good and they're just doing what's best. But season 2 in particular started to flip this a bit on its head, but this is even getting more, and we see Elliot himself coming to realization that was kind of a juvenile perspective. He calls it like dorm room philosophizing, where he's realizing that things are more complicated than that, and he's actually wanting to sort of fix things from within, which is why he, sort of joined E-Corp. So now it's sort of making sense to me. So that was actually a really philosophical change for Elliot's character. That's really important going forward, because in fact, they changed it ever since the very first episode, where it was called E-Corp. He sees it as Evil Corp, so everything we see is Evil Corp. It actually switched back to E-Corp for a little bit, because he was starting to come to realization that they're not actually evil, and he actually refers to them as a necessary evil. And but still the way he cleaned house was absolutely amazing. Of course, no one suspects him of doing that. And so that was great. So it's not saying that it's perfect, not saying that E-Corp is perfect or it's a bastion of good. It's still a rat-infested hellhole, but he was saying just thinking of it as evil is too simplistic. And I love that. And it seems to me it's almost addressing a lot of people's complaints about the first 2 seasons, particularly season 2, with these 2 episodes as a whole. And I just think they're just doing an amazing job at doing it. So it was interesting. We didn't really get any Angela in this episode. I actually thought it could have benefited a bit because of the other part of the montage and the way it ends with Elliot being sad. Also, seeing the people in the subway and those emoji heads. That's amazing. That's another beautiful touch, is how he's saying everyone has simple emotions. But at the end, he realized his emotion is sad, and he has a sad face, and it feeds into his depression. And this gets into more of his psyche, which is actually, even though you may not have seen this, always been an integral part of the show, because the main show is about an alter ego called Mr. Robot who's running and doing all this crazy shit. So his mental health is very much at the forefront. So I talked about this in the past, about my theory, and I think it was somewhat confirmed by this episode. As my theory was, that I mentioned before, was that in season 2, with being in prison and making peace with his mother and stuff like that, he was starting to recover and get more healthy mentally, and that's why it was diminishing Mr. Robot's power. Now, there's quite a different dynamic here in season 3, because towards the end of season 2, Elliot could actually, when Mr. Robot thought he was shutting out Elliot would show up when he wasn't expecting. And I love that. And then Elliot would actually take over for Mr. Robot without his permission. Now, the reason why that might not be the thing here is because he's sad and depressed, and that might be a side effect, or it could be Mr. Robot has a defense mechanism for Elliot taking over when he's not, is keeping Elliot completely separate, which is what he gets, which is what Mr. Robot says in his sort of interchange with Krista, which is amazing. I'll get to that in a second, but I'm starting to get the impression, I think this episode somewhat confirmed that Elliot is, by what Mr. Robot was telling Krista, about how she was interfering. That she was the one who was fucking things up and making it impossible for them to function the way it used to be. He's like, I want things to go back to the way they used to be, which does illustrate that things are definitely different now than they were before. And from Elliot's perspective, like, as far as he knows, he thinks Mr. Robot's gone. This is what was touched on at the end of the last episode, where he thought maybe it was like a Fight Club situation where the gunshot actually killed the alternate personality, which is a story beat that never really made sense in Fight Club. It was just done for plot convenience. So I'm glad Mr. Robot wasn't doing the same thing. I almost felt like it was. Elliot was kind of thinking, oh, maybe Mr. Robot's dead, but not really. He just cut himself off completely, and they're completely separate. So he's hiding from Elliot, basically. So as far as Elliot knows, he's gone. But he said, even they showed it like in the previous one, that he doesn't feel Mr. Robot's presence anymore like he used to. But he must know that he's still there because he wanted Krista to talk to him. Now, let me get into this. The scenes we get with Krista, which were, again, these scenes were amazing. Pure, like, even the first scene with her where it was mainly just him, trying to open up and talk about his feelings. Again, this is him trying to get mentally healthy, and we see that he's very depressed, and he's not even sure why, and I don't think Krista isn't sure why. And it's funny, like, when he all of a sudden just started thinking about him as a child building a snowman with Darlene, and she asked him, what made you think of this? And he couldn't come up with an answer. I still don't know what this is about exactly, but I'm sure it's very important. And they play this like very dramatic music too, and he seemed really surprised that he didn't know why he thought of it. And the other thing I found really interesting is that he thought that he already told Krista about the fact that his father pushed him out the window. Now, my first thought here is that he was getting Krista confused with us, the audience, or his imaginary friend. Because he's still talking to his imaginary friend, which is us, the audience. So you think he would be able to tell the difference. I wonder if this is a denotion that he's getting the two of them confused, or I don't know, maybe it means something else, but it seems important somehow, the fact that he was like dead sure that he told Krista about this, but he never did. It just goes to speak, I guess, to his memory issues, which he's had, because in the first season, of course, he forgot that Darlene was his sister. So he definitely has some memory issues, and that might be more of what's coming up as more of confusion of what's going on, which I found really interesting. So then we get this amazing scene. This scene is so good. It's hard for me to put into words. But when Krista did ask to speak to Mr. Robot, and first of all, the way this was played, like, from a filmmaking perspective, was simply amazing. How they started with Elliot and then sort of blended his voice with Mr. Robot, and then had Christian Slater take over completely. And I love how they are sort of playing with it, because in the past two seasons it was whenever Mr. Robot was there, Christian Slater took over, and that's all you see. But they're sort of playing with it a bit more and showing Elliot or Mr. Robot from other people's perspective who see Elliot. And I love how they sort of play with it. So they blend the two voices together at first, but then they go full on to Christian Slater mode when he goes full on to Mr. Robot. And it's really interesting, the stuff that he says to her. I'm actually starting to think that he might be giving away too much. That Krista may find out that Elliot was responsible for the 5-9 hacks and all that, but I'm not sure if that was an issue. But what was more like fascinating about the scene was sort of the mental health side of it, because that's always been at the heart of the whole show, basically, because all the hacks and everything were a result of this alternate personality. And ever since season 2, Elliot's been fighting against him outright, and they're to the point now where they're rigid and not even, like, for lack of a better word, not even speaking to each other. They're like two halves that are completely separate. And it's interesting how he expresses this distress to Krista, and in fact he uses Krista to communicate something to Elliot, because basically saying she's compromised. So it's like he knew, I think Mr. Robot knew that Darlene planted that thing on the computer. So he was trying to tell Elliot because he needed to know. And that's why he was so upset that they're so separate now, because Elliot should be seeing some certain things that he needs to see. But it's interesting that he didn't elaborate. I suppose he didn't want Krista. He couldn't outright tell Krista this, of course. So maybe that's why he was a bit cryptic about what he said to her. But he said just enough so Elliot could figure out what was going on. Just saying that we're compromised. More specifically, that she compromised us. And I wasn't sure who the she was referring to at first. I thought maybe it was Angela. Maybe it was White Rose. But then it became clear it was actually Darlene, which is really fascinating. And yeah, again, so this whole scene was just amazing, especially when Mr. Robot just steps up into Krista's face and just gets all up in her shit. And the whole demeanor he was having, like, oh, you're really hot and attractive or whatever, and then quoting Freud and stuff like that, is showing Krista a side of Elliot that she's never seen before and didn't know that she was capable of. And the fact, of course, that he's more outgoing, more social, looks her right in the face, and then instantly goes back to being the shy, timid Elliot. So it reminds me of other like sort of split personality movies and stuff like that I've seen before. So they are getting more into that, because it was always a part of the show, but they never really focused too much into this. So I really hope that they explore this a lot more, because there's a lot they could do with this story, as it is pretty much at the heart of the whole show. But we also, in the previous one, they show a little clip from season 1 with Krista's, asshole boyfriend that Elliot extorted and stole his dog, and that's why he went to prison. And I was like, oh, why are they showing this asshole again? What does he have to do with the story? But then he shows up and gives Elliot the dog back. Now, I do think like the dog was kind of a nice touch to the show and to Elliot's character, and it was a bit disappointing in season 2 when the dog wasn't there anymore. So I think maybe the showrunners realized this, so they had to come up with an excuse or reason to get the dog back to Elliot. But that being said, I think this is good, and because I'm happy to get the dog back, I have no issue with that. In fact, it does actually make sense for the character that this asshole guy never liked the dog, because that was part of the reason why Elliot took the dog from him in the first place, because he was treating the dog like shit, so you could tell that the guy didn't even deserve to own the dog. And taking the dog back and having him arrested was more of revenge for Elliot telling his wife and ruining his life. That really didn't have anything to do with the dog itself. It was just a way for him to get back at Elliot. So it made total sense that, especially when the dog was sick and shitting all the house, as he says, that he would simply say, here you go, you wanted the dog so much, you have him. And of course they throw in the extra line that, he's shitting, let him shit all over your house like you shit all over mine. So in a way, it's a way of him sort of getting back at Elliot. Now, some of this reasoning is a bit thin, and it does come off as kind of obvious that the showrunners just wanted the dog back in the show, but I'm willing to forgive it. And it does make sense. Overall, it does make sense for the character, so I'm actually fine. I'm just glad to have this dog back. I hope we see more of it in season 3. So, there's also the storyline with Darlene. We actually see very clearly that Darlene was working with the FBI, although that was pretty damn obvious in the last episode too. And we get a pretty good time reference, actually, because the FBI, when they're talking, the Bureau is talking to Darlene, they mention that it's been 5 weeks since that incident that occurred in episode 1. So that means there's 5 weeks in between this episode and the last episode, and that is quite a huge time jump. That's even a bigger time jump than there was between seasons, which I think was only like 5 days or something. This is 5 weeks, which is interesting. I actually like that. I like the fact that this show's now, and in fact, this might be the biggest time jump we had in the show so far. If I remember correctly, someone might remember a bigger one, but it's pretty significant. But I think that's great. I love how they're sort of pushing things forward, but that means the whole time Darlene has technically been working for them, not really doing much to further that goal, so I could see why they're sort of pissed off about it. I'm more convinced than ever that the Santiago guy is working with the Dark Army, because he keeps, every single time DePiro tries to bring up the Dark Army, he keeps diverting. It's like, oh, they have nothing to do with it. They have nothing to do with it. And plus, I talked about in Season 2 how there were several huge, obvious giveaways in Season 2 that he must be working with the Dark Army. And I'm just reaffirmed that in this episode, that he keeps saying, oh, it's not them, it's not them. So that brings an interesting dynamic, because that he might be sort of a double agent from the Dark Army, because the Dark Army still want Elliot in play. So if DePiro ever does anything to jeopardize that, he might do something to change that, or take her out of the equation somehow. I don't know. But that's an interesting thing to think about. And I'm still convinced that he's, yeah. So anyway, Elliot and Darlene was quite interesting, because he's been avoiding her because he sees her as a trigger to Mr. Robot. And I'm not sure if that's actually the case. This episode left me questioning, because we know that Mr. Robot is showing up a lot more than Elliot thinks he is. And even though Darlene hasn't been there, apparently Mr. Robot, we assume anyway, has been doing his thing. Because that's the thing. In last episode, we got to see Mr. Robot with Angela and the Dark Army, and Tyrell and the Dark Army people, and we didn't get any of that in this episode. We mainly just got Elliot's perspective, other than that one scene with Krista. So we don't really know from this episode what Mr. Robot's been up to in those 5 weeks. I hope that they don't keep this like a secret or hidden for the rest of the season. I hope they do jump back to Mr. Robot's perspective at some point, so we can find out what he's up to. Because it does make me wonder if they're aware of what Elliot's been doing at E-Corp by diverting all the papers and sabotaging their attempts to destroy the building. And if they're taking steps to prevent him from doing that, or if they're completely ignorant of this, because Mr. Robot talked about how him and Elliot are completely separate. So maybe he, not only is Elliot completely ignorant of what he's doing, maybe he's completely ignorant of what Elliot's doing as well, which would be interesting. But so anyway, so I think Elliot's wrong about Darlene. So he is lonely, so he invites her over. But then she plants the thing on the computer, and Mr. Robot wakes up. And this is another scene. I love how they're playing with how they show Mr. Robot, because they show it as Elliot. In the past, they would just show Christian Slater and be like, oh, that's Mr. Robot. But at first, we are led to believe it's Elliot, but really it's Mr. Robot. And we basically see it from Darlene's perspective, because we're shown Christian Slater once she figures out it's Mr. Robot. She's like, oh, it's you. And I'm still not very clear on how much Darlene knows about Mr. Robot. I remember that Angela knew specifically about him. I know, like, back in Season 1, they knew that he was seeing his dead father. But I didn't know, like, I think Darlene still has no idea that all of the hacking and 5/9 hacks and all the stuff they did was all Mr. Robot, really, and that he was the one she was talking to this whole time. I don't think she's still aware of that, but she must be aware of this separate personality to some extent. I'm still not clear on what that extent is, because she does say, oh, it's you, when she recognizes that it is Mr. Robot talking to her. And of course, I don't think she still sees him as two separate people, because she still called him Elliot and says, you're a psycho. When she says you're a psycho, I don't think she was just saying that to Mr. Robot. I think she was saying that to Elliot in general. It's like, just stay the fuck away from me, you're a psycho. It makes sense, because he was being physically threatening to her. So I think Mr. Robot did catch what Darlene did and wanted Elliot to know. Now, I'm still not completely clear on towards the end of the episode, when Elliot goes to his computer and tricks the FBI into opening up this email so he can track them, if that was Elliot doing that or if that was Mr. Robot doing that. Because that's the thing, they're playing with the thing of not showing us Christian Slater every time it's Mr. Robot. So now we're left to question. We don't know. And we're basically stuck in the position as the other characters in the show. And I love that. I think that's great. Although I'm fairly sure that was Elliot at the end of the episode, because the whole point of the Krista thing was Mr. Robot trying to convey the information that they've been compromised. So I think he figured out what he meant by that. And that his computer was being tracked. And of course, that ending, where like the FBI, of course, when the FBI guy who was listening in played, I can't remember what song it was, but it was some crappy upbeat song. And as soon as I heard that, I was like, Elliot would never, ever listen to that type of song. This is not the type of music Elliot would listen to. So it's very obvious that that was just cover music that he was playing to cover up sounds or to throw them off or something. So as soon as I heard that, I knew something was up. And of course, we see him going into the safe house. I guess that's where they have Darlene's stash, so he shouldn't know anything about it. And he tracked him down to that. And it was such an exciting cliffhanger ending. I don't think too much will come of this. I don't think... because I don't think the FBI want to arrest him yet, because they still want to use him to find Tyrell. And that's the other interesting thing I almost didn't talk about, is the fact that Darlene was convinced he didn't know Tyrell because he outright said it, but then the FBI played that recording of the prison call we got in season 2, so now she doesn't know what to think. Like, it does make me wonder, though, from Darlene's perspective, Tyrell had nothing to do with the 5-9 hacks. In fact, the idea of it, even as close as recently as season 2 of Tyrell being involved, was absurd to her. So this is a huge revelation to her as well. So she has no idea how far back this relationship goes as well. And then, of course, we got the new F Society video, which very curious. I think Darlene assumed it was the Dark Army doing it, and that's what I assumed too, although it could possibly be Mr. Robot himself doing it, because we know that he's going off without Elliot's knowledge, so in that way he would be doing it in conjunction with the Dark Army, or it could just be like Tyrell or the Dark Army themselves, and Mr. Robot had nothing to do with it. I'm fairly sure this will be explained a bit later on. And it seemed pretty obvious to me what that video was warning about was the stage 2 thing. But it does make me question, the stage 2 now that Elliot has measures in place to stop it from happening. But I'm wondering if there are measures the Dark Army has in place to stop Elliot's measures. I don't know. But anyway, let's move on to the White Rose and Price, or Minister Chang and Price. This is very... I always thought their scenes were the most confusing to me in season 2 and sometimes boring, but this one was pretty straightforward and pretty out there. That we know that White Rose, or Minister Chung, wanted Price to do something, his UN Accord, for Congo, and now Price is holding against him because he's very pissed off about the whole currency war, as he calls it. And this is just Price having... Now, I love this interchange because White Rose is pretty much acting like Price is an ant, like he's nothing to him, which is surprising because he is like the CEO of the most powerful corporation in the world, at least in this universe apparently, and to treat him like he's nothing, I think is... I wouldn't say... I don't actually think he's in the right. I don't think he has as much power over Price as he claims to. And of course, they're basically in just a dick measuring contest here, where they both want to assert power over the other, and Price isn't going to stand for White Rose. And as soon as he stands up to him at all, White Rose just it's like, nah, fuck you. And in fact, we see that he goes to his lackey later and says, let's do stage 2 regardless. Because apparently, and I didn't know this before, and I don't think the audience knew this before, stage 2 was a contingency. They weren't always going to do it. They were only going to do it if they couldn't do their plan in Congo, which I'm still not completely sure what that's about. But I think that was like maybe an alternate site, so they wouldn't have to worry about E-Corp anymore or something. They could go work around them. But now he's so pissed off at Price, and this just shows how petty he is, that he's like, nah, fuck it, I don't care if the Congo thing works out. We're going to go ahead with stage 2 anyway. And again, it makes me wonder if he realizes Elliot has measures to prevent stage 2 from happening. Really interesting stuff. And of course, have to talk about Joanne Wellick. Now, whenever they kill off a main character, whenever any show kills off a main character within the first or second episode of the season, you got to think that this wasn't originally their long-term plan. That when they came time to write the season, they thought, okay, this character isn't working, or this character doesn't really fit in to what we want for the rest of the season, or a combination of two of them. So that's why they kill her off. And I do think it does. It did strike me that that was the case here, that they thought, well, there's really no... Joanne doesn't really fit into the story, so let's get rid of her. And to be perfectly frank, I don't mind at all, because she was always my least favorite character of the show, and especially in season 2. All of her scenes I thought were very subtracting to the main storyline. They were very boring, and I was like, oh god, this character again. In fact, I had that feeling when I first saw her. I was like, it's like a gut reaction. It's like, oh, not her again. This is going to be boring. But it was actually fascinating, because we do find out that her gambit with arresting Scott Knowles and blaming him for the murder and clearing Tyrell's name actually worked. However, I was a bit unclear of the fact, because they're talking like Tyrell's been vindicated, but like that doesn't necessarily get him off the hook for the 5/9 hack, does it? Because the last I heard, they were still assuming that he was the one running F Society, that he was behind everything. And I don't see how claiming of the murder charges would change that, so he'd still be, public enemy number 1. But I don't know. I did think that was interesting. And of course, like the whole relationship with the bartender, like we weren't sure what it was about at first in season 2, but then it made it clear that the only reason she was having an affair with him was to use him to get to Scott Knowles, because he was at that party and he could testify against him. So the whole relationship was a scam, but it was very clear that he was very much in love, almost sort of not a very healthy love. He didn't seem like a very healthy guy. He seemed like he was a bit attached and obsessed and mentally unstable. So then what happens next made absolutely perfect sense, and the fact that she would just be like, have her thug go out and rough him up, and it's like she wanted nothing to do with you anymore, and basically confirming that he was just being used by her all along. So the fact that he snaps and just shoots at them and kills them, like, that makes total sense. I totally bought it, and how they shot back at him. Now, I was wondering if they'd kill her off at all, but they did. And to be honest, I was almost cheering. Like, her character is quite despicable as well. So, I don't really mourn the death of the character, but I was actually really glad that they were writing her off the show, because she was always not kind of a boring part of the show, to be honest. But the way they did it was just, again, it was pulled off so well. Like the music, the way they just everything was done so well. And I love how they had the scene right after where you see them cutting into her head. And usually when they have a scene like that, it's like a fake out where they show someone opening a coconut or something, like, and to make you think that it's their skull being propped open, but really it's like, something else. And I love how they broke that expectation. They broke that convention. Like, nah, it's actually her skull. So that was great. It's like a fake out because it wasn't a fake out. Anyway. So, my rating for Undo, out of 10, I'm going to have to give this episode a 10 the best. I mean, this episode may be one of my favorites, if not my favorite, of the entire show. It was like all the different elements was amazing, like scene after scene. There was no part of this episode I thought, oh, this is a bit boring, oh, this is a bit filler, let's move on. It was all brilliant. Brilliant editing, brilliant cinematography, brilliant dialogue, brilliant character interaction, brilliant character insight, brilliantly moving the story forward. I was absolutely in love with this episode. And I do hope we get a lot more of this in season 2. So that's it from my review of Undo. Be sure to check back here every week as I continue to review episodes of Mr. Robot. Also be sure to check out my channel for many more videos on other shows like Star Trek, Game of Thrones, Discovery, The Expanse, and more. And be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.